Quick question, the word dollar, is it American English? Nope, not even close. It's Bohemian, as in, it comes from a town in what's now the Czech Republic. Here's a fact. The US government didn't actually create the dollar sign. Nobody's completely sure who did. And here's the thing that should really bother you. For the first 100+ years of American history, the US Mint wasn't even the main supplier of coins Americans used every day. A foreign coin was. So the dollar, the most powerful currency on earth, the thing sitting in your bank account right now, has a backstory that's honestly way weirder than the eagle on a coin. Version most of us got taught in school. Let's go through it. Back in 1520, a rich vein of silver was discovered in a valley in what's now the Czech Republic, in a town called Joachimsthal, Joachim's Valley. The local count started minting big, chunky silver coins from that ore, and he called them Joachimsthalers, which, understandably, nobody wanted to say in full, so people shortened it to Thaler. That word traveled fast. It got picked up across German-speaking Europe, then bounced through Dutch as de alder, and by the time English speakers got their hands on it, it had settled into dollar. So before the word ever touched American soil, it was already floating around Europe for 2.5 centuries as a generic term for a big, solid, trustworthy silver coin. Sort of like how Hoover became the word for any vacuum cleaner. Dollar became the word for any respectable chunk of silver. And the coin colonial Americans actually respected most wasn't British, it was Spanish. Here's something that should feel a little strange. In the 1700s, the 13 British colonies were chronically short on British coins. Britain deliberately limited how much currency it shipped over, partly to keep the colonies economically dependent. So Americans used what they could actually get their hands on, and what circulated the most was the Spanish silver dollar, minted from silver mined in Spanish territories in Mexico and Bolivia. Officially, it was called the piece of 8, because it could be physically cut into 8 wedges, each worth 1 bit. Yes, that's where 2 bits comes from. A quarter was 2 of those 8 wedges. This Spanish coin was everywhere. It was reliable, it had consistent silver content, and honestly, it was just better designed for actual trade than most of what Britain was sending over. It became the informal standard of colonial commerce for decades, so when America needed a name for its own future currency, dollar wasn't some patriotic new invention. It was the coin everybody already trusted, wearing a new flag. Remember that dollar sign mystery from the top of the video? Here's the leading theory, and it ties directly back to that Spanish coin. Spanish and Mexican peso amounts were commonly abbreviated in old ledgers and letters as TS, the letter P for peso, followed by a lowercase s. Merchants writing quickly, over and over, eventually started letting the S slide up and overlap the P, and that scribbled little shortcut is thought to have gradually flattened into the single-line, 2-stroke symbol we use today. There are other theories floating around too. One claims it comes from the Pillars of Hercules wrapped in a ribbon, a symbol stamped on Spanish coins. Historians generally lean toward the ES theory as the stronger one, but nobody has ever found a smoking gun document proving it outright. So the symbol representing the most powerful currency in the world is, technically, still a best guess. Now here's the last thing before we slow down and go properly chronological. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress needed to pay for an army with no functioning tax system to back it up. Their solution? Print paper money. Lots of it. It was called the Continental. They printed more and more and more, and with nothing solid really backing it, the value collapsed. By the early 1780s, a continental dollar was worth a tiny fraction of its face value. The phrase, "not worth a continental," entered the American vocabulary and stuck around for a solid century afterward as shorthand for something totally worthless. So the very first American dollar experiment ended in a full-blown trust collapse, which is honestly a rough way to start a currency's life story. But it's also exactly the lesson the founders carried into the next chapter of America's history of currency. By 1792, the new United States government had a real constitution, a real treasury, and a real problem: no unified national currency. So Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1792, which did 3 big things. First, it officially created the US dollar as the national unit of currency. Second, it established the US Mint in Philadelphia to physically produce coins. And third, this is the part people forget. It set the dollar on a bimetallic standard, meaning its value was defined in terms of both gold and silver simultaneously. That sounds tidy on paper. In practice, it was a headache for the next 100 years. Gold and silver don't hold a perfectly fixed value relative to each other. Their relative worth drifts with supply and demand, so the US. Government was constantly fiddling with the exact ratio between the two metals, trying to keep both types of coins circulating instead of one metal quietly disappearing from pockets because it had become more valuable melted down than spent. And here's the detail that really shows how young and shaky the system was. That Spanish dollar we talked about, it didn't just fade away once America had its own mint, it stayed legal tender, officially usable as payment, in the United States until 1857. That's 65 years of America's national currency, sharing the stage with a coin stamped by the Spanish crown. The dollar had a name and a mint. It didn't yet have a monopoly. For most of the 1800s, America didn't have anything close to the centralized banking system we're used to today. There were fights, real political fights, over whether the country should even have a national bank at all. The first Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791, allowed to lapse in 1811. The Second Bank of the United States followed in 1816, and then President Andrew Jackson, who despised centralized banking, killed its charter renewal in the 1830s. After that, America entered what's called the free banking era, a period where individual states chartered their own banks, and those banks issued their own paper notes. Picture that for a second, thousands of different banknotes from thousands of different banks circulating at the same time, each one only as trustworthy as the bank that printed it. Counterfeiting was rampant. So was outright fraud. Some banks were basically designed to fail the moment too many people tried to redeem their notes, which earned them a wonderfully blunt nickname, wildcat banks, because some were supposedly located in such remote spots that only wildcats would find them. Then the Civil War hit, and the federal government needed to pay for it fast. In 1861 and 1862, it started issuing paper currency that wasn't backed by gold or silver at all, just backed by government promise. They were printed with green ink on the back, and people started calling them greenbacks. That's not a nickname that faded, by the way. It's still slang for American cash today, more than a century and a half later. To try to bring some order to the chaos, Congress passed the National Banking Acts in the 1860s, creating a system of federally chartered banks and a more uniform national currency. Better, but still not centralized. America still had no true central bank, and that gap was about to cause a serious problem. In 1907, a wave of panic hit Wall Street due to a failed stock scheme. Confidence in banks collapsed, people rushed to pull their money out all at once, and several major banks and trust companies actually failed. The whole financial system nearly seized up, and it was stabilized, somewhat awkwardly, by one private individual, the banker J.P. Morgan, who personally coordinated a rescue effort by locking a room full of bankers together until they agreed to bail out the weaker institutions. That's a wild sentence to say out loud in the 21st century. The entire American financial system was saved because one very rich man got a group of bankers into a room and basically wouldn't let them leave. Congress looked at that situation and reasonably concluded, maybe we shouldn't be relying on one guy's personal Rolodex to prevent economic collapse. So in 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, creating America's central bank, the Federal Reserve. Its job was to manage the money supply, act as a lender of last resort during crises, and generally provide the kind of stability the country had been improvising its way through for over a century. This is the point where the dollar stops being a patchwork of state banknotes and Spanish coins and becomes something closer to what we'd recognize today, one national currency, backed by one national institution. For decades, the dollar was pegged to gold, meaning, in theory, you could exchange your paper dollars for a fixed amount of actual gold. That system held up reasonably well until the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, when a wave of bank failures and economic collapse put enormous strain on it. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt did something that still surprises people when they hear it for the first time. He made it illegal for most American citizens to privately own significant amounts of gold. Executive Order 6012 required people to turn in their gold coins and bullion to the government in exchange for paper currency at a fixed price. The idea was to give the government more flexibility to expand the money supply and fight the economic collapse without being handcuffed by a rigid gold backing. It's a strange episode to picture, government agents quite literally asking ordinary Americans to hand over their gold. It stayed illegal for individuals to hold significant gold for investment purposes for over 40 years, only becoming legal again in 1974. Then came World War II, and with it, a new global plan. In 1944, representatives from over 40 countries met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and built a new international monetary system. Instead of every currency being tied to gold individually, only the US dollar would be pegged to gold at 35 an ounce, and every other major currency would be pegged to the dollar instead. In one conference, the dollar went from America's currency to the anchor of the entire global financial system. That's a massive promotion. Fast forward to the late 1960s. The dollar had a problem, and it was a problem of success. The US had printed and spent a lot of dollars abroad, funding the Vietnam War, funding domestic programs, and foreign countries were sitting on huge piles of them. Some of those countries started getting nervous and asking to cash their dollars in for gold, like the system promised. The trouble was simple arithmetic. America's gold reserves were nowhere near large enough to cover every dollar in circulation if everyone asked for gold at once. It was, honestly, the exact same problem every overpromised currency in history has run into, going all the way back to ancient coin debasement, just playing out on a planetary scale. So on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television on a Sunday night and announced that the United States would immediately suspend the ability to convert dollars into gold. No warning to allies, no new international agreement lined up. Just, that's over now. It's remembered today as the Nixon Shock, and it's one of the most consequential 5-minute TV appearances in economic history. It quietly ended the entire Bretton Woods system and, with it, the last direct link between the US dollar and gold. From that point forward, the dollar has been what's called a fiat currency, valuable because people trust it and the government requires it for taxes, not because it's backed by a shiny metal locked in a vault. Here's the part that should logically confuse you. Cutting the gold link should have weakened the dollar's global authority. Instead, within a few years, the dollar arguably became more entrenched worldwide than ever. How? Oil. Through the mid-1970s, the US worked out an arrangement with Saudi Arabia, and by extension, most of the OPEC oil-producing nations, where oil would be priced and sold on international markets almost exclusively in US dollars, regardless of which two countries were doing the trading. In exchange, the US offered military support and security guarantees. Think about what that actually means in practice. If you're a country that needs to import oil, and pretty much every country needs to import oil, you now need US dollars to buy it no matter who you are or who you're buying from. That created permanent, built-in global demand for the dollar that had nothing to do with gold at all. Economists nicknamed the whole arrangement the petrodollar system, and it's a huge part of why the dollar didn't just survive losing its gold backing, it thrived. So where does that leave us? The US dollar today is the world's dominant reserve currency, meaning it's the currency central banks around the planet hold the most of, and the currency most international trade and debt gets priced in, even between two countries that aren't the US at all. That status gives America a uniquely unusual economic advantage, sometimes called exorbitant privilege, a phrase coined by a French finance minister back in the 1960s, who was, let's say, not thrilled about it. Because the world needs dollars, America can borrow more cheaply and run larger deficits than almost any other country could get away with. But that dominance isn't written in stone. Over the last couple of decades, you've probably heard chatter about de-dollarization, countries trying to trade more in their own currencies, central banks diversifying their reserves, that sort of thing. Reserve currency status has changed hands before in history. The British pound sterling held a similar throne for a long stretch before the dollar took over in the 20th century. Nothing says the torch can't eventually pass again. For now, though, the numbers are still overwhelmingly in the dollar's favor. It remains, by a wide margin, the most held, most traded, and most trusted currency on the planet, which is a pretty remarkable outcome for a currency named after a valley in Bohemia, first popularized by Spanish coins, nearly wrecked by a wartime printing spree, and only fully cut loose from gold less than a lifetime ago. So next time you pull a dollar bill out of your wallet, you're not just holding a piece of paper with a president's face on it. You're holding the end result of 5 centuries of silver mines, wildcat banks, a locked-door bailout meeting, a Sunday night TV announcement, and an oil deal with Saudi Arabia. Not bad for something that started as a mispronounced word for a coin from a Czech mining town. If you liked this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It is very much appreciated. Let me know down in the comments which part of the dollar's history surprised you the most, and I'll see you in the next one.